So today we're going to talk about why your bullpens or off-season training, velocity, mechanical work hasn't necessarily transferred as well to the game as you might like. As a preview, it's not necessarily because you're just mentally weak. There's a better way. We're going to go through some of the science in this video, and we're going to give you a progression that you can use through the off-season to make sure that your bullpens transfer better to the game. But first, I'm Ben Brewster, co-founder of Tread Athletics. We do remote and in-person coaching for thousands of high school, college, and professional pitchers. That being said, let's dive into the video. So to recap the problem, whether it's a velocity transfer issue or a command transfer issue, maybe you can throw a lot harder in the bullpen and you get into games and it just doesn't transfer. You throw 95 in bullpens, you get into the game and you're throwing 90, 92, just trying to locate, not really feeling comfortable tapping into everything in your mechanics, everything in your body. Maybe you're throwing 80 or 90% strikes in the bullpen, you get into the game, you get a little bit tentative, and it just doesn't end up translating as well. You throw a lot less strikes, you have command issues only when the lights come on, only when you get in a game situation. So the TLDR is that the environment really, really matters when it comes to actually transferring what we're doing in a training, from a training standpoint, to the game. And when I say environment, I'm talking factors like the umpire, the hitter, fans, hecklers, the adrenaline of a game situation, base runners having to contend with looks, holds, pickoff moves, dirt mound, the condition of the mound. Is the mound dug out? Is there a hole in it? Is it uneven? The weather, the game situation, right? All these variables in the environment that you have to contend with in game, in season, when the lights come on. And you don't necessarily have to contend with that in catch play, in flyouts, in long toss, in a nice, easy, low pressure bullpen at 11 a.m. in December. These are variables that you don't have to deal with until the lights come on. And so how can we bridge that gap a little bit better from a specificity standpoint? How can we make our training more chaotic, less scripted, less linear, more alive, so that it can bridge the gap a little bit better to our actual in-game experience and what we're going to have on the mound? And so one analogy that I'll use is the zoo animal versus the jungle animal. Which one's going to survive in the wild? So what do you want to be? Do you want to be a zoo animal? Do you want to be a jungle animal? And how do we create jungle animals on the mound where you can throw them into any environment, throw them into the chaos, and they will still survive. They'll still find a way to perform. And so when it comes to training, again, you've kind of already can guess the theme of this. It's let's make these bullpens, let's make our training as specific as possible. But again, we can't just dive straight into spending the entire offseason throwing an Intrasquad, spending the entire offseason just throwing to live hitters. So what does it look like to bridge from velocity work, pitch design work at one part of the offseason and still be able to work on those more highly specific bullpens later on in the offseason? And that's what we'll get into now. So this is the idea of bullpen levels or a bullpen progression. And it doesn't necessarily mean that level 10 is better than level 1. It just means at different points in the offseason, depending on what you're trying to work on, this is how you can conceptualize or progress the specificity of your bullpens. And so level 1 might be something where it's a velo focus. There's no catcher, you're just throwing into a net, you're throwing into a 9 pocket, and we're just working on maybe pitch shapes or working on maximum velocity, but it's not very similar to what you're going to actually encounter in a game situation. So now I'm working into a net. Level 2 would be a standard bullpen. You're throwing to a catcher, nothing else, and we're just working on fastballs. Level 3, now we're beginning to mix all our pitches. We're still calling our own pitches. It's very controlled. It's very linear. It's relatively low pressure. Level 4, now we added a stand-in hitter. And so whether it's a dummy hitter or ideally an actual human hitter, provides a little bit more game context. We're adding that additional visual stimulus to have to contend with. This is especially important for something like trying to locate a sweeper, where if you never have a hitter in there and you're just trying to work on locating a sweeper, when a hitter actually steps in there, it's going to completely change your release. It's going to completely change what's happening subconsciously, because now you have to start the pitch behind their hip or throw it at their hip or worry about hitting him with that pitch. And so I think the stand-in hitter is probably the lowest hanging fruit for a lot of pitchers. If you don't have a dummy hitter, get a dummy hitter, find a way to have a buddy stand in there, put a trash can there, whatever you have to do. I think that visual stimulus is one of the main things that changes from how most players throw that level 3 easy bullpen most of their career to what you're actually encountering when you step on a game mound. Level 5 would be a stand-in bullpen, but now you're keeping counts. The catcher's calling pitches, and so it just becomes a little bit more game-like, where it's not just 10 fastballs in a row, 10 changeups in a row, 10 curveballs in a row. Level 6, ghost runner pen. Now you're having to contend with imaginary runners. You're mixing up holds, you're mixing up looks. The catcher can call pickoff moves. Level 7 would be a Heckle bullpen. This one's really fun. You just have to set some guardrails on what your teammates can and can't say, but they're essentially trying to distract you however they can. They're talking some smack and they're trying to distract you. And what you'll find when you do this, I did this in college myself, is that initially your command will actually get worse. It'll start to distract you, but pretty quickly you'll find that your body has to actually figure out how to tunnel vision. And so your focus really starts to hone in, and you actually will find that some of the best bullpens you ever have are those Heckle bullpens, because you're having to tune out those distractions. Level 8 would be a consequence bullpen. So similar to level 7, but we're adding some sort of punishment or consequence or putting something on the line just to add a little bit more pressure and turn that specificity up a notch. And now we're starting to get real game-like. Level 9 would be live batting practice. So again, you're not worrying about fielders or game situation or anything like that, but you're outside, you're on a dirt mound, and you're actually throwing to hitters, they're taking cuts. And so very, very specific. Level Level 10 would be Intrasquad. There's not quite the amount of pressure that you're going to face in a true game situation. Nothing's really on the line, but this is going to transfer almost 1-to-1 in most cases compared to how some of those earlier bullpens will transfer. And then level 11 would be a pressure Intrasquad. So let's figure out how to actually put something on the line from an Intrasquad situation, whether it's starting with a 1-0 or a 2-0 count, whether it's starting with the bases loaded or a runner on second base, whether it's having your teammates or the dugout chirp you the entire outing, whether it's adding some sort of visual or auditory distractions, playing crowd noise. You can be creative through this process. And this is just the starting point. There's other ways to add challenge, add specificity to what you're doing from a bullpen standpoint. How about adding the pitch clock for pros, having to contend with that tempo of their bullpen? How about pre-fatiguing the legs or having to run a couple sprints before your bullpen to have to contend with when your heart rate gets elevated in a game situation, which is often hard to actually emulate in a bullpen setting. So again, just a couple ideas, but the whole idea is how can we scale and progressively add game context to your bullpens as you prepare for the season. So let's talk through how you might construct an off-season plan for a hypothetical pro pitcher, taking this all into account. Let's say you have to be ready for early March for spring training. So you basically would reverse engineer the off-season from, I need to be ready from this date. How am I going to work on velocity or adding a new pitch at certain points? How am I going to make sure I'm ready for day number 1? And so September might be a deload phase. The focus is on strength and conditioning. It's on adding some size, adding some strength, adding some power, improving mobility. October might be an on-ramp and general velocity phase, pull downs or long toss or other just general velocity building type techniques. November, you start to ramp up to the mound. Maybe this is mound velocity work. Maybe this is pitch design work. It's learning a new pitch. It's hammering out pitch shapes. December, you go through this leveling up bullpens context. So maybe you start December level 2, level 3 bullpens to a catcher. You end December more in that level 5 bullpen range where you're throwing with standard hitters in there. And then January, February, you'd be throwing live. You'd be throwing level 5 through 9 bullpens, and you'd be really preparing for the season for that 6 to 8 weeks in a very specific training approach. Let's talk through an actual case study, a real life example of how this all came together, because I wasn't always necessarily aware of just how important this environmental factor was. Now think that we need a little bit more time to actually work on that transfer phase, 8 to 12 weeks prior to the start of the season versus 4 to 6 weeks. And that jives with my own experience. Daniel Blair, he was a 87 to 89 mile an hour mid-major righty. He historically walked somewhere between like 5 to 7 per 9. So he didn't have great command. His stuff wasn't great. And it just all in all, like a lot of you can probably relate to that, needed to figure it out on multiple fronts. And so for a couple of years, we worked through his mechanics in the off season. We got his velocity up to mid-upper 90s. So he was 94, 96, touching 97. He'd go out, something would happen. There'd be some tweak to his mechanics or he'd have a bad outing and it would just kind of, it would fall apart on him. So it happened 2 years in a row. He'd come back, he'd be throwing 90, 92. He was still walking batters. And so eventually we said, okay, we need to spend the majority of this offseason actually working in as much context as possible, meaning let's get into live ABs as soon as we can in the offseason. Let's make sure you've been facing hitters for a while leading up to the season so that things don't fall apart when you go in season again. And so he was able to get signed out of pro day, throwing 95, 96, and he has been able to hold roughly a 3 walk per 9 average in his first 2 years of pro ball since making that shift in his off-season training. So the key takeaway is not to only throw in maximum specificity bullpens where you're only throwing live ABs all off-season. It's just to have a plan for each bullpen. Is the focus velocity output? Is the focus on pitch design and learning a new pitch shape? Or is the focus on actually transferring this to the game? Just have an appreciation for how important that transfer piece is and don't ignore it leading up to next season. Again, you can steal this bullpen levels concept. I think you're really gonna find that the transfer is a lot better going into next season in your own career. And if you guys enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you're not already subscribed, drop a comment down below if you have any comments. And I would love to hear suggestions from you guys as well. What are some future topics you'd like me to cover? I'll definitely read all those comments and see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.